The Last War. Chapter 1. The Deceptive Peace. The twin suns of Terra Nova cast their golden light across the sprawling capital city, illuminating spires of crystalline metal that reached toward the heavens, like prayers made manifest. From her office in the highest tower of the government complex, Commander Sarah Chen watched the morning parade wind its way through the broad avenues below, celebrating the 5th anniversary of the Dominion's defeat. Children who had never known war waved flags of the Human Federation, their laughter carried on the wind to her open balcony. Veterans marched with pride, their scars hidden beneath dress uniforms, while families reunited by peace embraced along the parade route. The sight should have filled Sarah with satisfaction. This was what they had fought for, what so many had died to achieve. Instead, a cold knot of unease sat heavy in her stomach. "The quarterly reports are encouraging," Admiral Torres said, entering her office with a stack of data tablets. His hair had gone completely gray in the years since the war, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him invaluable during humanity's darkest hours. "Trade routes are fully operational. The reconstruction of the outer colonies is ahead of schedule, and our alliance partners report stable relations across all sectors." Sarah turned from the window, accepting the reports with hands that remained steady despite her growing anxiety. The numbers were indeed impressive. Industrial output had surpassed pre-war levels, population growth was accelerating, and the network of defensive stations that protected human space had never been stronger. "And yet you look like a woman expecting bad news," Torres observed, settling into one of the chairs across from her desk. "What's troubling you, Sarah?" Before she could answer, the secure communications array on her desk chirped with an urgent priority signal. The holographic display materialized, showing the concerned face of Dr. Elena Vasquez from the Deep Space Monitoring Station at the galaxy's edge. "Commander, we have a situation," Dr. Vasquez began without preamble, her usual scientific composure cracked by barely concealed fear. 3 hours ago, we lost contact with the research station at Kepler 442. Complete communications blackout. No distress signal, no automated beacons, nothing. Sarah felt the familiar chill of approaching danger. "Equipment failure?" "That was our first assumption," Dr. Vasquez replied, manipulating controls off-screen. "So we dispatched the patrol cruiser Vanguard to investigate. Commander, they're gone too." The ship reached the Kepler system and transmitted one final sensor sweep before. Nothing. The hologram shifted, displaying the last data burst from the Vanguard. Sarah's enhanced awareness, still augmented by Qir'ath technology from their alliance years earlier, immediately grasped the impossibility of what she was seeing. The sensor reading showed normal space one moment, then an expanding field of absolute nothingness the next. Not destruction, but erasure, as if reality itself had been deleted. "How many souls were on that station?" Torres asked, his voice tight with professional control. 2,000 researchers and their families, Dr. Vasquez answered. The Vanguard carried another 300 crew members. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of command settle over her shoulders like a familiar shroud. She had hoped, they had all hoped, that the galaxy's appetite for war had been sated by the Dominion conflict. The rebuilt worlds, the flourishing trade routes, the children laughing in the streets below, all of it suddenly seemed fragile as spun glass. "Alert the Emergency Council," she ordered, "and send word to our allies, all of them. If something can make entire installations vanish without a trace, we need to know what we're dealing with." As Dr. Vasquez's hologram flickered out, Sarah moved back to the window. The parade continued below, but now the celebration seemed hollow, a brief moment of joy before the storm. In the distance, she could see the massive shipyards where humanity's fleet underwent routine maintenance. Sleek vessels that had proven their worth against the Dominion's armadas. Would they be enough for whatever was coming? "Sarah," Torres said quietly, "the sensor readings from the Vanguard. I've never seen anything like them. Whatever did this, it's not using conventional weapons." She nodded, her mind already racing through possibilities. The Dominion had been brutal but predictable, their technology based on principles humanity could understand and counter. This was something else entirely, a force that could simply erase matter from existence, leaving no trace of its passing. Contact the Qir'ath, she decided. If there's anyone in the galaxy who might recognize this technology, it's them. The ancient aliens had become trusted allies since their first contact, sharing knowledge and wisdom gained across millennia of galactic observation. Their own technology was advanced beyond human understanding, but they had always been careful to warn humanity about forces that existed beyond even their comprehension. As Torres left to implement her orders, Sarah remained at the window, watching the parade slowly wind its way toward the government plaza. In a few hours, she would be expected to give a speech celebrating humanity's achievements, to inspire hope for the future and confidence in their continued prosperity. Instead, she found herself remembering the words of an ancient Qir'ath philosopher. Peace is not the absence of conflict, but the brief silence between the ending of one war and the beginning of the next. The silence was ending. She could feel it in the way the air seemed to thicken with anticipation, in the subtle wrongness that her enhanced senses detected at the edge of perception. Somewhere in the vast darkness between the stars, something had awakened. Something that made entire worlds disappear as if they had never existed. The parade reached the plaza below, and thousands of voices rose in celebration of humanity's hard-won peace. Sarah listened to their joy and felt her heart break, knowing that she might be among the last to hear such sounds for a very long time. War was coming again, and this time the enemy was something humanity had never imagined in their darkest nightmares. Chapter 2. The Void Consumes. The emergency council chamber fell silent as the holographic display materialized above the central table, showing the expanding zone of nothingness that had once been the Kepler system. 12 worlds, 3 inhabited moons, and a thriving asteroid mining operation, all gone, replaced by a region of space that registered as absolutely empty on every sensor array in the sector. "How is this possible?" demanded Chancellor Morrison, his face pale as he studied the impossible data. The elected leader of the Human Federation had been a war correspondent during the Dominion conflict, and Sarah had hoped his experience with devastation would prepare him for this moment. The horror in his eyes suggested otherwise. Admiral Torres manipulated the display, expanding the view to show the broader galactic region. "It's not just Kepler," he reported grimly. "In the past 18 hours, we've lost contact with 4 more systems along the galactic rim. The pattern suggests something moving inward from beyond known space, consuming everything in its path." Dr. Vasquez's voice carried across the chamber from the Deep Space Monitoring Center. "Commander Chen, we're detecting the same energy signature that preceded the Kepler incident. The Arcturus shipyards are directly in its path." Sarah felt ice form in her veins. Arcturus was one of humanity's most vital installations, home to over 50 million souls and the primary construction facility for their defensive fleet. If it fell, humanity would lose a significant portion of their military capability. "Evacuation protocols?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Impossible," Torres replied. "We're talking about evacuating an entire system in a matter of hours. The transport capacity simply doesn't exist." The holographic display shifted again, showing the enemy force as it emerged from the void between galaxies. Sarah's enhanced perception struggled to process what she was seeing. Ships that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, their forms shifting and flowing like liquid shadow made solid. They moved through space without regard for physics, accelerating and changing direction in ways that should have torn any material apart. "The Zhora," whispered a new voice, and every head in the chamber turned toward the corner where a Qir'ath entity had materialized without warning. The ancient alien's form pulsed with agitation, its normally serene presence crackling with fear that transcended species barriers. "You know them?" Sarah asked, rising from her chair. "We know of them," the Qir'ath replied, its mental voice carrying undertones of despair that chilled everyone present. They are older than our civilization, older than memory itself. We had hoped, we had prayed they were extinct. The alien being approached the holographic display, its form becoming more solid as it concentrated. The Zhora are not from this galaxy, not from this dimension. They exist in the spaces between realities, feeding on the fundamental forces that hold the universe together. When they appear, entire galaxies die. Chancellor Morrison leaned forward, his politician's instincts searching for options. Can they be reasoned with? Negotiated with? The Zhora do not communicate, the Qir'ath answered. They do not conquer or enslave. They simply consume. Matter, energy, space-time itself, all of it becomes fuel for their inexorable expansion across the cosmic void. Sarah studied the tactical display, her mind automatically calculating force dispositions and defensive strategies. The human fleet was formidable by the standards of known space, enhanced by Qir'ath technology and hardened by years of conflict. But what she was seeing defied every principle of warfare she had learned. Our weapons, she said, will they have any effect? Unknown, the Qir'ath admitted. The Zhora's last incursion into this galaxy was over 1 billion years ago, before our species achieved sentience. The ancient records speak of entire star-faring civilizations that simply vanished. No ruins, no survivors, no trace that they had ever existed. The chamber fell silent, except for the soft hum of life support systems. Sarah looked around the table at faces that reflected her own growing desperation. These were the leaders who had guided humanity through its darkest hour, who had found the strength to rebuild an empire from the ashes of near extinction. Now they sat powerless before an enemy that might as well have been a force of nature. Status of the fleet, she asked Admiral Torres. 90% of our forces are currently on patrol or conducting training exercises, he replied. We can have the main battle groups assembled at Arcturus within 6 hours. But Commander, he paused, struggling with the words. What do we do when conventional tactics are useless? Before Sarah could answer, alarms began wailing throughout the chamber. The holographic display shifted automatically to show real-time feeds from the Arcturus system, where the first Zhora vessels had begun to emerge from the void. The sight defied description. The enemy ships seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time, their forms shifting between dimensions in patterns that hurt to observe directly. As they moved toward the massive orbital shipyards, reality itself began to warp around them. Space twisted into impossible geometries, and the very stars seemed to dim as if their light was being absorbed. All stations, this is Admiral Reeves, came a transmission from the Arcturus Defense Command. We are engaging the hostile force. All civilian transports are to maintain distance from... The transmission cut off as one of the Zhora vessels passed through the flagship Invincible without apparent contact. For a moment, both ships occupied the same space. Then the human vessel simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed, not vaporized, erased, as if it had never been built. Dear God, whispered someone in the chamber. On the display, the battle continued in eerie silence. Human ships fired everything they had: plasma cannons, fusion torpedoes, experimental gravity weapons provided by the Qir'ath. The weapons seemed to pass through the Zhora vessels without effect, or worse, were absorbed and turned back against their users. Within minutes, the entire defense fleet was gone. The massive orbital platforms that had taken decades to construct vanished one by one, consumed by an enemy that seemed to exist beyond the reach of conventional physics. 50 million lives ended in silence, leaving no trace that they had ever lived. Sarah found herself gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles had gone white. Around her, the other council members sat in stunned silence, their minds struggling to process the scale of what they had just witnessed. "How long?" she asked quietly. The Qir'ath entity consulted information sources beyond human perception. At their current rate of advance, the Zhora will reach the core systems within 72 hours, Terra Nova itself. The alien paused, its form flickering with distress. Terra Nova will fall within the week. Sarah looked around the chamber one final time, seeing her own determination reflected in the faces of her colleagues. They had been forged in the crucible of war, tempered by sacrifice and loss. They would not surrender without a fight, even against an enemy that could erase them from existence with a thought. "Admiral Torres, issue a general mobilization order," she commanded. "Recall every ship, every squadron, every vessel capable of mounting a weapon. Contact our allies, the Centauri Republic, the Vegan Alliance, everyone who owes us favors from the Dominion War." "Sarah," Chancellor Morrison said quietly, "what can we possibly do against that?" She turned to face the holographic display, where the Zhora continued their inexorable advance toward the heart of human space. The enemy was incomprehensible, unstoppable, a force that existed beyond the boundaries of known science. But humanity had faced impossible odds before. They had survived the Dominion's overwhelming assault, found allies in the most unlikely places, and rebuilt their civilization from near extinction. They would find a way to fight this new threat, or they would die trying.
"We do what we've always done," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the authority that had guided humanity through its darkest hours. "We adapt, we learn, and we make them pay for every inch of space they take."
The war for humanity's survival was about to begin, and this time the stakes were nothing less than the continued existence of everything they had ever known. Chapter 3. The Gathering Storm. The vast hangar bays of Terra Nova's primary orbital station buzzed with activity as ships from across the galaxy converged on humanity's capital. Sarah stood on the observation deck, watching as vessels from a dozen different species took position in the growing armada. Sleek Centauri cruisers with their distinctive curved hulls, angular vegan destroyers bristling with experimental weapons, even the rarely seen crystal ships of the Etherian Collective, all had answered humanity's desperate call for aid. "Impressive turnout," Admiral Torres commented, joining her at the viewing port, "though I'm not sure numbers will matter against an enemy that can erase matter from existence." Sarah nodded grimly. In the 3 days since Arcturus had fallen, 17 more systems had simply vanished. The Zhora advance was methodical, inexorable, consuming everything in their path with the patience of a cosmic force. Worse, each victory seemed to make them stronger, as if they were feeding on the very fabric of space-time itself. "Status report," she requested, turning away from the window. "Our allies have committed everything they can spare," Torres replied, consulting his datapad. "Combined fleet strength is now approaching 8,000 vessels. The Qir'ath have also provided what assistance they can: enhanced weapon systems, improved shields, and something they call dimensional stabilizers that might help protect our ships from the Zhora's reality warping abilities." "Might help?" Torres's expression darkened. "The Qir'ath are being honest about their limitations. They've never actually fought the Zhora. Their entire knowledge comes from archaeological records and theoretical models. We're essentially conducting an experiment with the survival of galactic civilization as the stakes." A soft chime indicated an incoming priority transmission. The holographic display materialized, showing the familiar form of Dr. Elena Vasquez, though her appearance had changed dramatically since the crisis began. Her hair had gone prematurely gray, and her eyes held the haunted look of someone who had stared into the abyss and seen it staring back.
"Commander,"
Dr. Vasquez began without preamble, "we've made a breakthrough in understanding the Zhora's technology. It's not good news." The display shifted to show a complex, three-dimensional model that hurt to look at directly. The structure seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, its geometry following principles that violated every law of physics Sarah knew. "What am I looking at?" she asked. "A Zhora ship," Dr. Vasquez replied. "We've been analyzing the sensor data from Arcturus, trying to understand how they achieve their reality warping effects. The answer is that they don't exist entirely in our dimension. They anchor themselves in what we're calling null space, a region outside normal space-time, where different physical laws apply. Admiral Torres leaned forward, his tactical mind immediately grasping the implications. That's why our weapons pass through them. We're shooting at projections, shadows of the real ships. Exactly, Dr. Vasquez confirmed, but we found something else. The Zhora ships aren't invulnerable. They require enormous amounts of energy to maintain their dimensional displacement. If we could somehow disrupt their connection to null space, they'd be forced into normal space where we can hurt them, Sarah finished. What would it take? Dr. Vasquez manipulated the display, showing theoretical energy calculations that made Sarah's enhanced perception real. We'd need to generate a localized dimensional collapse, essentially tearing a hole in space-time itself. The power requirements are substantial. A new voice interrupted the conversation as the Qir'ath entity materialized beside them. It is possible, the ancient alien confirmed, but the cost would be enormous. Such a weapon would require the focused output of an entire star. Sarah felt a chill as the implications became clear. You're talking about turning our sun into a weapon. Not Terra Nova's sun, the Qir'ath clarified, but there are other systems, uninhabited worlds with suitable stellar masses. The process would be irreversible. The star would collapse into a micro-singularity, creating a cascade effect that would destabilize local space-time. How local? Torres asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. The effect would propagate across several light years, the Qir'ath admitted. Any world within the influence zone would become uninhabitable. The space itself would become dangerous to navigate for centuries. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of command crushing down on her shoulders. They were talking about sacrificing entire star systems to create a weapon that might be able to hurt the Zhora. The moral implications were staggering, but the alternative was the extinction of all life in the galaxy. How long would it take to construct such a device? She asked. With our combined technologies and resources, the Qir'ath calculated, perhaps 36 hours. But Commander, you must understand, once activated, there would be no way to control the cascade. It would consume everything within its range. A priority alert interrupted the discussion as new sensor contacts appeared on the tactical display. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she recognized the signatures. Zhora vessels, dozens of them, emerging from null space at the edge of the Terra Nova system. They're here, Torres whispered, his face pale with shock. 18 hours ahead of schedule. Sarah watched as the enemy force began its inexorable advance toward the heart of human civilization. The assembled fleet was impressive by any conventional standard, but she knew it would be nothing more than a brief delay against an enemy that could erase ships from existence with a thought. Begin evacuation of non-essential personnel from Terra Nova, she ordered, and signal the fleet. We buy time for the weapons construction, whatever the cost. Sarah, Chancellor Morrison's voice came over the communication system. Are you seriously considering turning a star into a weapon? The ethical implications. The ethical implications of allowing the galaxy to be consumed are worse. Sarah cut him off. Admiral Torres, you have command of the fleet. Your objective is simple, keep the Zhora from reaching Terra Nova for 36 hours. Torres straightened, accepting the impossible mission with the same calm professionalism that had carried him through the Dominion War. Understood. What about you? Sarah turned back to the viewing port where the lights of thousands of ships created a constellation of hope against the darkness. Each vessel represented hundreds or thousands of souls who had come to fight for humanity's survival, knowing they might not see another dawn. I'm going to oversee construction of our stellar weapon, she replied, and I'm going to pray that we're not about to become the very thing we're trying to fight, destroyers of worlds. As alerts began wailing throughout the station and the combined fleet moved to intercept the approaching Zhora force, Sarah felt the familiar cold focus of combat settling over her mind. They had perhaps 36 hours to complete the most ambitious and dangerous project in galactic history, while holding back an enemy that could erase matter from existence. The final battle for the galaxy's survival was about to begin, and Sarah Chen found herself commanding forces that would either save civilization or destroy it in the attempt. There would be no middle ground, no partial victory. They would either triumph completely, or there would be nothing left of them to mark their passing. The stakes had never been higher, the margin for error had never been smaller, and somewhere in the darkness between the stars, the Zhora continued their patient advance toward the heart of everything humanity had built. Time was running out. Chapter 4, The Price of Desperation. The battle for Terra Nova began at the system's edge, where Admiral Torres's combined fleet met the Zhora advance in a confrontation that redefined the very nature of warfare. Sarah watched from the bridge of the hastily converted stellar engineering vessel Prometheus, her attention divided between the impossible task of turning a star into a weapon and the desperate fight raging across a dozen light minutes of space. Dimensional destabilizer approaching critical threshold, reported Dr. Elena Vasquez, her hands dancing across control panels that hummed with barely contained energies. Around them, Qir'ath technicians worked alongside human engineers, their combined efforts focused on the most ambitious project in galactic history. We need another 6 hours to achieve stable resonance. 6 hours. Sarah turned to the tactical display, where the fleet situation grew more desperate by the moment. Human ships vanished in silence as Zhora vessels passed through them like ghosts, while the few successful hits seemed to barely slow their advance. They were fighting shadows with solid weapons, an exercise in futility that was costing thousands of lives. Admiral Torres to Prometheus, came the transmission, his voice tight with strain. We've lost 30% of our forward elements. The Centauri battle group just disappeared. All 70 ships, gone in an instant. Sarah gripped the command rail, feeling each loss like a physical blow. These weren't just statistics, they were people she had served with, allies who had answered humanity's call for aid, warriors who deserved better than to be erased from existence without even the chance to strike back. "Hold position, Admiral," she ordered, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. "We need more time." "Time we don't have," Torres replied. "The Zhora have changed tactics. They're not just consuming our ships, they're learning from them. The latest wave is adapting to our weapons patterns, becoming more efficient with each engagement." The display shifted to show the enemy's advance, and Sarah's enhanced perception immediately grasped the horrifying truth. The Zhora weren't just destroyers, they were evolving, incorporating the tactical knowledge and technological principles of everything they consumed. Each fallen ship made them stronger, more adaptable, more deadly. "Dr. Vasquez," Sarah called, "can we accelerate the process?" "Not without risking a cascade failure that would destroy the entire system," the scientist replied. "Commander, what we're attempting has never been done before. We're literally rewriting the fundamental forces that hold a star together. One miscalculation, and we could trigger a supernova that would sterilize half the sector." A new alarm sounded as more Zhora vessels emerged from null space, their impossible forms creating ripples in reality that registered on every sensor array in the system. Sarah counted at least 50 new contacts, each one representing destruction beyond comprehension. "They're massing for a final push," Torres reported. "All remaining ships are falling back to the inner system perimeter. We'll make our stand at Terra Nova itself." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of command and the burden of impossible choices. The stellar weapon was humanity's only hope, but completing it would require sacrificing the brave souls who were buying time with their lives. Every minute they delayed meant more deaths, but rushing the process could doom them all. "Status of the evacuation?" she asked. 60% of Terra Nova's population has been relocated to deep space shelters," reported Chancellor Morrison from the planet's surface. "But we're talking about 14 billion people, Sarah. We can't move them all in time." The mathematical reality was inescapable. No matter what choice she made, billions would die. The question was whether their sacrifice would purchase survival for the remainder of galactic civilization or merely delay the inevitable for a few more hours. "Commander," the Qir'ath entity materialized beside her, its form flickering with distress. "There is another option, a more dangerous one." Sarah turned to face the ancient alien, seeing something in its ethereal features that might have been desperate hope. "Explain." "The weapon we are building requires time to charge, time to achieve the resonance needed to tear through dimensional barriers," the Qir'ath began. "But if we were to sacrifice ourselves, if our ships were to enter null space and detonate their cores within the Zhora formation, it would create a localized dimensional collapse," Dr. Vasquez finished, her scientific mind immediately grasping the implications.
The feedback would destabilize their entire fleet, forcing them into normal space where our weapons could affect them.
"How many ships?" Sarah asked, though part of her already knew she wouldn't like the answer. "All of them," the Qir'ath replied simply. "Our entire remaining fleet, perhaps 200 vessels. The detonation must be simultaneous and precisely coordinated to create the necessary cascade effect." Sarah stared at the being that had become humanity's greatest ally, seeing the weight of its own species' extinction reflected in its alien features. The Qir'ath were offering to sacrifice themselves completely, to end their billion-year existence in a single desperate gambit to save the galaxy. "There has to be another way," she said, though her enhanced perception was already calculating the tactical probabilities and finding them wanting. "There is not," the Qir'ath stated with the finality of absolute certainty. "Our time has ended, Commander Chen. We have watched civilizations rise and fall for eons, guided them when we could, mourned them when they failed. Now it is time for us to take our final action, to ensure that life itself does not perish in this dark hour." The bridge fell silent except for the urgent chatter of technicians working to complete the stellar weapon. Sarah looked around at the faces of her crew, seeing her own anguish reflected in their expressions. They had all signed up to risk their lives for humanity's survival, but asking an entire species to commit suicide was something else entirely. "Admiral Torres," she called, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. "Status of the fleet." "We're down to 40% strength," he replied. "The Zhora have broken through our outer perimeter. They'll reach Terra Nova's orbital zone within 2 hours. 2 hours. Sarah looked at the stellar engineering displays, where the converted star pulsed with barely contained energies. The weapon would be ready in time, but only if the Qir'ath sacrifice bought them the necessary opening. She was being asked to orchestrate the extinction of humanity's greatest allies, and the weight of that decision threatened to crush her. "Commander," the Qir'ath said softly, "we have made our choice. The question is whether you will allow us to make it meaningful." Sarah met the alien's gaze, seeing in its ethereal features the same determination that had carried her through the darkest moments of the Dominion War. The Qir'ath weren't asking for permission to die. They were asking for the chance to make their deaths count for something. "Send the signal," she ordered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Coordinate with Admiral Torres for the final assault. And thank you for everything." The Qir'ath's form brightened one final time, and Sarah caught a glimpse of something that might have been peace in its alien features. "It has been an honor to witness your species' growth, Commander Chen. Use the time we purchase wisely." As the ancient being faded from view for the last time, Sarah turned back to the tactical display where 200 Qir'ath vessels were beginning their final journey into null space. In moments they would detonate their cores in a coordinated explosion that would either save the galaxy or doom it to darkness. The price of survival had never been higher, and Sarah Chen had never felt the weight of command more keenly than in that moment when an entire civilization chose extinction to purchase hope for the future. Chapter 5. The Final Gambit. The moment of sacrifice came with no fanfare, no dramatic speeches. Only the cold mathematics of coordinated annihilation. Sarah watched the tactical display as 200 Qir'ath vessels phased into null space, their energy signatures becoming ghostly echoes on her sensors as they entered the same dimensional realm where the Zhora ships dwelled. "Detonation in 60 seconds, Admiral Torres's voice carried across the communication channel, his words steady despite the magnitude of what they were witnessing. All fleet elements, stand by for dimensional cascade effect. Sarah gripped the command rail of the Prometheus, her enhanced perception tracking the impossible choreography of sacrifice unfolding before them. The Qir'ath ships spread out through null space, positioning themselves within the Zhora formation with precision that spoke of millennia of tactical knowledge. 30 seconds, Dr. Vasquez called out, her voice tight with concentration as she monitored the stellar weapon's charging sequence. Commander, the dimensional destabilizer is showing resonance fluctuations. The cascade effect might interfere with our weapon's targeting matrix. Can you compensate? Sarah asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Unknown, Vasquez replied honestly. We're in uncharted territory here. No one has ever attempted to coordinate a stellar weapon with a dimensional collapse. The seconds crawled by with agonizing slowness. On the tactical display, Sarah could see the Zhora fleet continuing its inexorable advance toward Terra Nova, unaware of the trap being prepared around them. Their ships moved through space like living shadows, reality bending around their impossible forms. 10 seconds, Torres announced. All ships, brace for impact. Sarah found herself holding her breath as the final countdown reached 0. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. The Qir'ath vessels remained positioned within the enemy formation, their energy signatures stable but unchanged. Then, space itself screamed. The dimensional cascade began at the molecular level, reality fracturing like glass under impossible stress. The Zhora ships, caught between dimensions as the collapse propagated outward, were suddenly forced into normal space-time with violent, explosive force. Their elegant forms twisted and buckled as they encountered the physical laws they had been evading, while the Qir'ath vessels vanished in bursts of pure energy that painted the void in colors that had no names. "It's working!" Torres shouted over the communication channel. "The Zhora ships are materializing in normal space. All units engage at will." The combined fleet surged forward, years of frustration and loss driving them to pour everything they had into the suddenly vulnerable enemy. Plasma cannons, fusion torpedoes, gravity bombs, weapons that had passed harmlessly through the Zhora ships moments before now found solid targets. But the celebration was short-lived. As the dimensional cascade effect spread outward, Sarah realized with growing horror that it wasn't stopping. The collapse was propagating beyond the intended boundaries, reaching toward Terra Nova itself with fingers of twisted space-time. "Dr. Vasquez?" she called urgently. "The cascade is expanding." "I'm seeing it," the scientist replied, her hands flying over the control panels. "The interaction between null space and normal space-time is creating a feedback loop. We need to fire the stellar weapon now before the cascade reaches the inhabited worlds." Sarah looked at the weapon's charging sequence, still 30 minutes from completion. Around them, space continued to fracture as the dimensional collapse spread like a cosmic cancer, consuming everything in its path, including the remaining ships of the Allied fleet. "We can't wait," she decided. "Fire the weapon at current power levels." "Commander, that will only give us 60% of projected effectiveness," Dr. Vasquez protested. "It might not be enough to stop the remaining Zhora forces." "And if we wait, there won't be anything left to protect," Sarah replied. "Do it." The stellar weapon fired with the fury of a dying star, its beam lancing across space toward the center of the Zhora formation. Where it struck, reality itself burned, creating a wound in space-time that pulled nearby ships into its gravitational embrace. Dozens of Zhora vessels were consumed in the artificial singularity, their impossible forms finally meeting an equally impossible force. But it wasn't enough, nearly.